At midnight in a winter storm, a woman he. At midnight in a winter storm, a woman he had never met knocked on his door. She said, "My son died 6 weeks ago. I still have milk. Please let me help her." This is the story of what happened next. There is a sound every father fears more than anything else in this world. Not the cry of a child, not the scream that splits the night and brings a man running from across the yard with his heart in his throat. Those sounds are terrible, yes, but they are sounds of life. They mean the child is still fighting. They mean there is still something to fight for. The sound every father truly fears is the silence that comes after. That silence has a weight to it. It presses down on a man's chest like a stone the size of a millstone, and it does not move and it does not lift no matter how hard he breathes. Caleb Morgan knew that silence well. He had been sitting inside it for the better part of 2 months. It was early spring in Millstone Creek, Colorado, but the spring had not yet made up its mind to arrive. The snow still clung to the corners of the hills like a man refusing to leave a house that no longer belonged to him, stubborn and gray and unwilling. The wind came down through the valley every evening with a sharp edge to it, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in wool and settles into the bones. The cottonwoods along the creek bed stood bare, their branches reaching upward with nothing to show for it. The Morgan Ranch sat at the eastern edge of the valley, set back from the main road by a long dirt track that turned to mud this time of year. The fences needed tending. The barn needed a new crossbeam on the north side. The garden plot behind the house had gone unturned since last autumn, the soil hard and gray and waiting for someone to remember it. From the road, the place looked like it was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, and something else beneath those things, something harder to name. The smell of a house that has lost its center, the smell of a life interrupted in the middle of a sentence. Caleb sat on the floor with his back against the wall beside the dying fire. His boots were caked with mud from the afternoon chores. His shirt was half buttoned, the sleeves rolled to the elbow, the fabric wrinkled in the way of a man who had stopped paying attention to such things. His face was the face of a man who had not slept a full night in 8 weeks. The lines around his eyes had deepened. The jaw was set in the permanent tension of someone bracing for a blow that might come at any moment. In his arms, his daughter Lily made a sound so small it nearly broke him. Not a cry, not really, more of a thin, reedy whisper, the kind of sound a flame makes just before it goes out entirely. She was 2 months old. She weighed less now than she had 3 weeks ago. Her small fists had stopped clenching with any real strength. Her face, which had once gone red and furious with hunger, had gone pale and still, and she turned away from the bottle with the slow, exhausted movement of something that had already decided it was too tired to keep trying. The bottle lay on the floor where it had rolled when Caleb set it down. Goat's milk warm from the fire. The 12th time this week he had tried. The 12th time this week she had refused. He pressed his lips to her forehead. Her skin was cool and dry, and he held them there for a long moment, his rough hands trembling as they cradled her head. "Come on, baby girl," he said. His voice was barely a whisper itself. "Come on. Stay with me." The fire popped once and settled lower. Caleb had buried Ellen Morgan on a Tuesday. That was the fact he kept returning to, in the way a man returns to a wound, without quite meaning to, pressing on it to see if it still hurts, finding that it always does. A Tuesday in February in ground that was half frozen still and had to be worked for 2 hours before it would accept what they were asking of it. He had done most of the digging himself because he had needed something to do with his hands. Ellen had known before he did that something was wrong. She had known it in the way women sometimes know things about their own bodies that no doctor has yet put into words. She had not told him directly. She had told him the way she told him most important things, sideways and gently, in small actions rather than large declarations. Dr. Henry Ford had been more direct in that frank and careful way of his standing in the kitchen doorway in November with his hat in both hands. Ellen's heart, he said, was not strong enough for what was coming. There were risks. There were serious risks. They had discussed precautions, careful plans, everything that could be done. They had done all of it. It had not been enough. The night Lily was born, Caleb stood outside the bedroom door for 4 hours. He stood so still he left boot prints in the same spot on the floorboards. He could hear Dr. Ford's voice inside, low and steady and focused, and Ellen's voice, and then the sounds that no man is meant to hear from the other side of a door with nothing he can do about them. Then all at once Lily cried. The sound filled the cabin like something released from a long captivity. Caleb's whole body went weak with relief at that first cry, his hand reaching for the doorframe to hold himself upright. And in that same moment between one breath and the next, Ellen's voice stopped. He carried that silence with him every day since. He buried her on a Tuesday. That same day, Lily turned 2 weeks old. The weeks that followed were the longest of his life. He had faced hard things before. He had lost cattle in a blizzard the winter of '75. He had sat up 2 nights straight nursing a sick horse back to something like health. He had worked land that did not want to be worked and built fences in weather that made every nail feel like punishment. He was not a man who walked away from hard things, but this was different. This was a helplessness that went all the way down to the bottom of him, and he could not find solid ground beneath it. Lily would not take the goat's milk. He had tried warming it to different temperatures, tried different bottles, tried soaking a cloth, and letting her suckle that. He had ridden to the Hensley place and asked as plainly as he could manage if Mrs. Hensley might be able to help, and she had looked at him with such sorrow in her eyes when she told him she had weaned her youngest 3 weeks ago that he had been unable to say anything at all on the ride home. He had gone to 3 other ranches after that. He had asked each time with less voice than the time before, until asking had become an act that cost him something real. Most doors had closed with kindness. A few had closed without it. He had tried rice water. He had tried a thin sugar solution once in the middle of the night, when desperation had narrowed his thinking to a single point, and Lily had screamed herself hoarse, and he had held her through all of it, rocking and whispering, and feeling the full weight of his own uselessness pressing down on him like the sky pressing down on the earth. Now, in the gray light of another long evening with the fire nearly out and the wind working at the corners of the cabin, Caleb Morgan looked down at his daughter and understood with quiet, terrible clarity that he was running out of time. He set Lily carefully in her cradle, tucking the blanket around her with hands that would not quite stop shaking. She made that small, fading sound again. He stood there looking at her for a long moment. Then he went to the shelf near the door and took down a scrap of paper, a piece of brown paper that had once wrapped a bag of flour. He found the stub of a pencil in the drawer below. He wrote slowly the letters, uneven in the way of a man whose hands were made for reins and fence posts and not for writing. If anyone has milk to spare, please help my baby girl. He carried it outside into the wind and pinned it to the outside of the door with a cut of wire. The wind immediately tried to take it. He bent the wire tighter, pressing the paper flat against the wood, and then he went back inside and shut the door against the cold. He sat down beside the hearth and closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest them for a moment. In the cradle, Lily breathed. In the cabin, the fire died down to coals. 2 miles away on the main street of Millstone Creek, a woman was sitting in the smallest room of Dorothy Clay's boarding house, and she was not sleeping either. The room faced north, which was why Dorothy rented it for less than the others. In the winter, the cold came straight through the single window and pulled along the floor. Grace Alderton had learned to keep her shoes on indoors and to sleep in 2 layers of her heaviest wool, which she now wore so often she had stopped noticing the weight of them. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at nothing in particular, and she listened to the wind. Every morning for 6 weeks she had woken to the same physical reality, a tightness in her chest that was not grief, or not only grief, though it was that too. A fullness that pressed against the bindings she wrapped around herself each morning before she could face the day. Her body's own stubborn insistence on providing for something that was no longer there to receive it. Dr. Ford had explained it in his careful and considerate way 3 days after Henry died. It would ease over time, he said. A few more weeks. The body takes time to understand what the mind already knows. Grace had thanked him and gone back to her room and sat on the edge of this same narrow bed and thought about how strange it was that the body could be so relentlessly determined to go on doing something that had already become a form of suffering. She thought about Henry every hour of every day, not always in words, sometimes just in the awareness of his absence, the way a missing tooth makes itself known, not by its presence, but by the gap. It leaves the place where your tongue goes without your permission, looking for something that is no longer there. She had named him after her father's father, a man she had never met, but whose name had always seemed to her to carry a kind of solidity, a heft that a person could lean against. Henry Thomas Alderton. He had weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. He had had blue eyes and a way of gripping her little finger with his whole fist that made her feel for the first time in a long time like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He had lived for 6 weeks. She had named him well, she thought. He had been solid. He had fought hard. The fever had simply been harder. Grace Alderton had come to Millstone Creek from Columbus, Ohio, on a January morning so cold the windows of the train had stayed frosted even at midday. She had come at the end of a chain of decisions, each one following from the one before it, with a kind of grim logic that at the time had seemed like the only direction available to her. Thomas Alderton had died in March of 1877. He had worked the boiler room at Crane and Patterson Steelworks for 11 years, a careful and competent man who knew that equipment the way a good farmer knows his land. He had trusted it, and the trust had been misplaced because Frederick Crane, the owner's son, had known for 6 months that the primary relief valve on boiler number 4 was failing and had done nothing about it because doing something about it would have meant shutting down production for 2 weeks, and 2 weeks of shutdown was a thing Frederick Crane was not willing to accept. 12 men died. Thomas was among them. The company offered nothing. The lawyers the widows consulted offered the advice that such cases were very difficult and very costly and very rarely successful, and they recommended patience and prayer. Grace had neither patience nor prayer left in her by then. What she had was a talent for practical action and a stubborn refusal to wait for someone else to decide what came next. She found work as a medical assistant to Dr. Eli Wesley, a general practitioner, whose practice took him all over the south side of Columbus. She learned by doing the way she had always learned best: how to clean and dress a wound properly, how to recognize the early signs of fever in an infant, how to distinguish between the cry of a child in pain and the cry of a child who was simply hungry, how to help a woman through a difficult labor, how to sit with a person who was frightened and make them feel by the steadiness of your presence alone that things might yet be all right. She worked for Dr. Wesley for 3 years. She was good at it. She was better at it than most people with formal training, or so he told her more than once. But the work paid little and the rooms she could afford on that pay were cold and damp, and she was 26 years old and still had enough belief left in her to think that something better might still be possible. The advertisement was on the 3rd page of the Columbus Dispatch in the small notice section at the bottom of the column, sandwiched between an offer for land and a notice of estate sale. Ralph Dunmore, Millstone Creek, Colorado, 41 years, ranch owner, seeking a wife of good character and practical temperament. Honest correspondence welcomed. Arrangements through Patterson and Sons, Denver. She had read it 3 times that evening. She had told herself she would think about it. She had thought about it for 3 days. Then she had written the letter. Ralph Dunmore wrote back in a hand that was plain and clear and a little careful, like a man choosing his words because he meant them, not because he was trying to impress anyone. He did not promise her much. He promised her a solid house with good windows and a kitchen that didn't flood in the spring. He promised her honest work and honest treatment in the kind of life where what you put in is what you get back. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle and the land, and the way the mountains looked in the early morning when the light first came over them. She wrote back. He wrote again. Over 4 months through the autumn and into the beginning of winter, they built something between them through those letters that felt cautiously like the beginning of trust. She did not tell him about the pregnancy. It was not, she told herself, deception. She had become pregnant in the last months of Thomas's life in the way that life sometimes asserts itself most stubbornly just before it is taken away. She had known before she wrote the first letter. She had decided she would tell Ralph in person where he could see her face and she could see his, where the truth would have a fair chance. She had been afraid that the truth in a letter without her voice behind it would sound different than she meant it. She had bought her ticket in December. She had boarded the train on a morning so cold the platform was glazed with ice. On the 2nd day of the journey, in the gray afternoon light of a Kansas plain, she had given birth to Henry in the train compartment with the help of a woman named Margaret Pierce, who was traveling to see her sister and who had delivered 3 babies of her own and who held Grace's hand through the worst of it and told her she was doing fine in a voice that allowed for no argument. Henry had arrived into the world announcing himself loudly and without apology. Grace had held him against her chest and breathed him in and felt for the first time in a long time that she was equal to whatever came next. What came next was Dorothy Clay waiting on the platform at Millstone Creek, not Ralph Dunmore. Dorothy was a woman of 54 who had run the boarding house on Main Street for 16 years and who served on the Women's Committee of the First Methodist Church and who had in that time developed an opinion about nearly everything and a particular talent for sharing those opinions in ways that could not quite be refused. She was not unkind exactly, but she was the kind of person who delivers bad news with a faint air of satisfaction, as though being the bearer of it has given her a small but real elevation in status. She handed Grace an envelope without preamble. Ralph Dunmore had died on a Wednesday morning a week before Grace arrived. His heart, the doctor had said, sudden and complete in the way of a man who had not known until the final moment that it was coming. He had been alive on Monday. He had not been alive on Thursday. Grace stood on that platform in the January cold with her valise in one hand and 6-day-old Henry in the crook of her other arm and the envelope in her fingers and the snow coming down around her, and she did not cry. She had gone past the point where crying was a useful response to things. She had been past that point for a while. She asked Dorothy if there was a room available at the boarding house. There was. The weeks that followed were the weeks of Henry brief and complete. She kept herself and him warm. She asked Dr. Ford, who came to check on them, the questions she needed to ask. She learned the small topography of his face the way she had learned everything that mattered thoroughly and by close attention. She counted his fingers every morning, not out of worry, simply because they were remarkable to her. Those 10 perfect fingers, smaller than she had thought possible, curling around her own with a grip that meant everything. The fever came on a Sunday. Dr. Ford came and stayed. He did everything that could be done. Grace sat beside the small bed they had made for Henry, and she did not move from it, and she talked to him in the quiet, steady voice she had used for frightened patients, the voice that said, without saying anything directly, that things might yet be all right. On Tuesday morning, Henry stopped breathing. Grace sat with him for 2 days. When Dr. Ford came back, he found her still sitting in the same chair holding Henry, in the same position she had been in when he left. He did not say anything. He came and sat beside her for a while. Then gently he took Henry from her arms and she let him go. 6 weeks had passed since then. The money was almost gone. Dorothy had stopped being indirect about it. The price of a train ticket back to Columbus was more than Grace had. There was nothing waiting for her in Columbus in any case. The rooms she had rented were long since given to someone else. Dr. Wesley's practice had hired a young man with an actual medical degree who charged twice what Grace had charged and was no better at the practical work. She was stranded in Millstone Creek, Colorado, in a north-facing room in a boarding house run by a woman who had begun to look at her with the specific expression of someone who is calculating what a person costs against what they contribute. Every morning the bindings, every morning the slow, quiet ache that the body refused to release. It was into this that Dr. Ford had come on a Wednesday afternoon, not to check on her this time, but simply to sit for a while the way he sometimes did, and in the course of sitting he had told her, not as a plea and not as a suggestion, simply as the truth of things about Caleb Morgan and the baby girl who would not eat. He had tried everything, Ford said. The man was good with land and cattle and all the hard practical things that kept a ranch alive, but he did not know how to ask for help, and he had been sitting alone in that cabin for 2 months with a child who was losing ground every day. Ford had delivered Lily. He had held that baby when she was 10 minutes old. He had watched her color come up and her lungs expand, and he had believed in that first honest moment that she was going to be a strong one. Now he was not sure she would make it to spring. Grace had looked at the wall while he talked and had not said anything. That night she lay in the narrow bed and put her hand against her chest and felt the physical fact of what her body was still carrying, what it was still producing in its determined and oblivious way, and she thought about a child 2 miles away in the dark who was running out of time. The second day she thought about it more. On the morning of the third day, she got up before light, and she dressed carefully, and she went to find Dr. Ford at his house on the north end of Main Street. He answered the door with a lantern and the slightly startled look of a man whose sleep has been interrupted. She told him what she was thinking. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, as honestly as she had come to expect from him, that the town would talk, that it would say things, some of them unkind, some of them worse than unkind. That a widow woman alone at a widower's ranch was the kind of thing that Millstone Creek would not let pass without comment, and the comment would not be gentle. Grace looked at him steadily and asked if he knew the road to the Morgan Ranch. He went inside and got a piece of paper and drew her a map. That was the third day. On the evening of the third day, the rain started thin at first, then harder as the dark came on, then something between rain and sleet as the wind came up from the north. By 9 o'clock, it had become a proper late winter storm, the kind that comes through fast and cold and means everything it says. Grace put on her heaviest coat. She wrapped her wool shawl twice around her shoulders and pinned it. She tied her bonnet strings tight beneath her chin. She picked up the small bag she had packed, nothing much in it, just the practical things, and she walked to the door of her room. From downstairs, Dorothy Clay's voice came sharp and carrying through the floorboards. She was talking to someone, telling them some story about someone who had overstayed their welcome, and Grace could not hear the words clearly, but the tone of them was perfectly legible. Grace went down the back stairs. The night was cold in a way that went beyond ordinary cold. It was the kind of cold that has intentions. The rain hit her face like something small and malicious, and the wind pushed against her from the side so that she had to lean into it to keep moving. The road that Ford had drawn on his map turned to a different kind of thing that night in the rain, the familiar landmarks made strange by darkness and by the water coming down. She fell once at the place where the path crossed a shallow drainage channel. Her knee hit the mud and her hands went down after it, and for a moment she knelt there in the dark, and the rain her palms pressed flat against the cold earth, and she simply breathed. Then she got up. She wiped her hands on her coat. She found the path again. She kept walking. The light from the Morgan Ranch showed through the rain when she was still 100 yards from it, a dim and wavering yellow glow through the water-streaked glass of the cabin window. She stood at the edge of the yard for a moment, the rain coming down hard around her, looking at that light. Then she walked to the door and knocked. 3 knocks, firm and deliberate. The knock of a person who has made a decision and is not reconsidering it. Inside, nothing happened. She knocked again. The door opened. The man who stood there was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical solidity that comes from years of actual work rather than the performing of it. His face was the face she had somehow expected without knowing. She expected it weathered and angular, and set in lines of exhaustion that had been there long enough to have settled in for good. He was holding a lantern in one hand and looking at her with eyes that were dark and careful and very, very tired. For a moment he said nothing. Grace stood in the rain and met his eyes and did not look away. "My name is Grace Alderton," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, given how cold she was and how far she had come and how much was riding on the next few moments. "I came to Millstone Creek to marry Ralph Dunmore. He passed before I arrived." She paused just long enough to let the essential truth of it land with the weight it deserved. "My son died 6 weeks ago. I still have milk. I heard about your daughter from Dr. Ford." She held his gaze. "Please let me help her." Caleb Morgan stood in his doorway and looked at the woman in front of him. He took in what she had told him. The name, he knew the name of his neighbor, Ralph Dunmore, a man he had meant to visit to offer his condolences and had not yet visited because the days kept happening faster than his intentions could keep up with them. This was the woman who had come to marry Ralph. The woman who had come all that way and found nothing but a closed door and an absence where a life was supposed to have been. He took in the coat soaked dark with rain, the bonnet strings plastered flat against her jaw, the bag hanging from one hand. He took in the steadiness of her eyes, which were gray and clear and did not waver. He took in what she was offering and what it had cost her to walk 2 miles in a winter storm to offer it. He stepped to one side. "Come in," he said. She came inside. She stood for a moment on the floorboards just inside the door, while rain dripped from the hem of her coat and formed a small dark pool around her boots. She was shaking, though she was holding herself in a way that minimized it. He closed the door behind her against the cold and the wind. She looked around the cabin, one quick, impractical assessment, taking in the dying fire, the cradle against the far wall, the general evidence of a house that had been managed but not truly tended for a long time. Then she looked at the cradle. The sound coming from it was so thin, it was almost not a sound at all. She crossed the room in 3 steps and stood looking down at Lily. The baby lay on her back, her face pale and still, her breathing visible in the faint rise and fall of her small chest but barely audible. Her lips were dry. Her hands had the limp, unfocused quality of a child who has stopped trying to engage with the world because the world has stopped giving her a reason. "May I?" Grace said. Caleb nodded. She reached down and lifted Lily from the cradle with the ease and certainty of a woman who had held many infants and knew exactly where her hands belonged. She carried Lily to the chair beside the hearth, the best chair in the room, the one with arms, and she sat down in it and settled the baby against her with the calm, unhurried movement of someone doing something they have done before. Caleb turned away. He stood facing the dark window, his hands at his sides, listening. For a moment there was nothing. Then there was. The small, wet, desperate sound of a child finally feeding. And then immediately after it, like a door opening into a room that has been sealed for a long time, a silence of a different kind. Not the silence of absence. The silence of something being restored. Caleb closed his eyes. He stood there with his eyes closed, and he breathed. The thing in his chest, the thing that had been squeezing without pause for 2 months, loosened in some small but real and unmistakable way. Just a fraction. Just enough to let one full breath through. She was very hungry, Grace said softly behind him. Almost a full day, he said. She wouldn't take the bottle. A pause. She's strong, Grace said. You can feel it, even now. He turned around. She was not looking at him. She was looking down at Lily, and there was something in her face that he recognized, though he could not have named it exactly. The look of a person who is holding something they desperately needed to be allowed to hold. She looks like her father, Grace said quietly. He didn't answer that. He moved to the fireplace and began building the fire back up, adding wood with careful attention, and by the time it was catching properly, he had his voice back enough to use it. Thank you, he said. She looked up then. Her eyes were wet, though she had not been crying in any way he could point to. I needed this, she said, more than you know. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire building, back to warmth, the rain coming down hard against the windows. Lily feeding with steadily increasing strength. Grace hummed something very low, almost under her breath, a sound more than a melody. And Caleb sat on the floor near the hearth with his back against the stones, and his knees up, and his head tipped back, and for the first time in 8 weeks, he came close to something like rest. By the time the rain had settled to a steady drumming, Lily had gone slack in Grace's arms with the deep, boneless sleep of a child who has finally eaten enough. Her cheeks, which had been pale and thin, already showed something faintly different, a trace of color at the edges, the beginning of a return. Grace looked down at her for a long moment. Then she looked up and found Caleb watching from across the room. I'll need to come back in the morning, she said, and every morning after for a while. He nodded once. I know, she nodded too. They understood each other on this point without needing to say more about it. He made up a pallet by the fire for her to sleep on because the storm was bad enough that sending her back out into it was not something he was willing to do, regardless of what Dorothy Clay or anyone else in Millstone Creek might have to say about it. She accepted without making it into more than it was. He woke before dawn and found her already awake, sitting in the armchair with Lily against her shoulder, both of them quiet in the gray light and the fire she had stoked back up before he had stirred. By full morning, Lily's color had come back. That evening, Grace returned to the boarding house and collected her things. She did not explain herself to Dorothy Clay. She answered the questions Dorothy asked with plain and minimal facts. She paid what she owed, which was less than Dorothy claimed, but more than Grace could comfortably spare. And she thanked her for the room, and she carried her valise out the back door into the gray afternoon light. She walked the 2 miles back to the Morgan Ranch. When Caleb heard her boots on the porch, he came to the door and opened it before she could knock. He looked at the valise in her hand and then at her face. She looked back at him without flinching. He stepped aside. The small room at the back of the house behind the kitchen had been a tack room once. It still smelled faintly of leather and rope. Caleb had cleaned it out the evening before. He had swept the floor and moved in a narrow cot with a proper mattress and a wooden crate that served as a nightstand. There was a peg on the wall for hanging things. The single window faced east, which meant it caught the morning light. When Grace stepped in and saw it, she stood still in the doorway for a moment. Then she set her valise down on the cot and turned and said quietly, "Thank you." He nodded and went back outside, and she heard the steady sound of the axe starting up again in the woodpile, and she unpacked her few things into the small space he had made for her, and for the first time in months, she felt something that was not quite peace, but that was the closest she had come to it in a very long time. That night, with Lily fed and sleeping in her cradle, and the fire banked for the hours ahead, Caleb sat at the work table in his study and went through the stack of papers and letters that had been sitting in the corner since February. Bills, receipts, notes in Ellen's handwriting about household accounts and supply orders. He moved through them slowly, not because any of it required urgency, but because sitting with them was a way of sitting with her. Near the bottom of the stack, he found the envelope. It was still sealed. The address on the front in Ellen's handwriting said Patterson and Sons, Denver, Colorado. The corner had a return address in the same hand, Morgan Ranch, Millstone Creek. A stamp had been affixed ready to send, but it had not been sent. He held it for a long time. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at the writing on the front and recognized it as the careful, deliberate version of Ellen's hand, the version she used when something mattered. Not the quick, slanted script of the notes she left for him about supplies. The full, careful letters of something she had thought about before she wrote it. He set the envelope down on the desk in front of him. He sat there in the quiet of the house with the fire going low and Grace's boots barely audible on the floor of the back room, and Lily breathing in her cradle, and the wind working the edges of the windows, and he looked at the envelope and thought about what it might contain. He did not open it. Not yet. He turned down the lamp and went to his own room and lay down on the bed with his boots still on, the way he had done every night since February, and he looked at the ceiling in the dark. In the cradle in the next room, Lily breathed steadily, calmly, with a fullness she had not had the day before. In the small back room, Grace Alderton lay on the narrow cot and looked at the ceiling and breathed her own slow breath. In the study, the envelope sat on the desk and waited. The days that followed the storm arrived quietly, one after another, each one a little lighter than the last, as the seasons slowly remembered what it was supposed to be doing. The snow on the hillsides retreated inch by inch. The creek behind the lower pasture ran higher with the melt, and in the mornings the air had a different quality to it, something less final than February, something that allowed for the possibility of what came next. Inside the Morgan cabin, a new rhythm established itself. Grace was up before the sun every morning, moving through the dim cabin with the economy of motion of someone who has learned to do necessary things in small spaces without making a production of them. She fed Lily in the armchair by the hearth, while the fire built back from its overnight coals, the baby's sounds shifting within the first week from the thin, desperate whisper of real hunger to something steadier and more demanding, the full-throated insistence of a child who has decided the world owes her its attention and she intends to collect. By the time Caleb came in from the morning chores, there would be coffee on the stove and Lily back in her cradle with her eyes tracking the light from the window with an alertness that had not been there before. He would stand in this kitchen doorway for a moment, snow still on his boots, and look at his daughter, and then he would look at Grace and he would nod once in the way of a man who has decided that some things do not require words. Grace understood that nod. It said everything it needed to say. He expressed gratitude the way men of his particular formation always expressed it, sideways and in action rather than declaration. The latch on the window of her back room had been stiff since she arrived, requiring a particular upward pressure with the heel of the hand before it would turn. She came back from the outhouse one evening to find it working smoothly, the mechanism cleaned and oiled, the job done sometime during the afternoon without announcement. The cot in her room had a thin mattress that left her hip aching by morning. She woke one day to find a second layer of quilting beneath her added, without comment, while she had been out feeding the chickens. When her boots came back from 3 days of mud work along the creek path, too stiff to put on, without effort, she found them by the door the next morning, treated with something that had softened the leather back to usefulness. She answered in kind. She was not a woman who sat still when there was work to be done. She had spent 3 years learning practical medicine from a man who believed that capability was demonstrated and not claimed, and she carried that lesson into every room she entered. She mended the shirts that had been piled on the chair in Caleb's room, not all at once, but one at a time, folding each one back to its place on the pile, so the diminishing stack announced itself gradually. She took over the kitchen entirely within the first week, not as a statement, but as a function, because she was better at it than he was, and they both knew it, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. She reorganized the medical supplies in the box above the kitchen shelf, which Dr. Ford had stocked with good instinct but uncertain arrangement, so that what was needed most was where hands could reach it fastest. Sam Reeves noticed all of it, and he did not like what he noticed. Sam was 28 years old and had worked the Morgan Ranch for 3 years, which meant he had known Ellen Morgan and had watched her run the household with a particular combination of warmth and competence that had made the place feel like something more than a working operation. He had respected Ellen. He had grieved her death in his private and inarticulate way by working harder and speaking less, which was the only form of grief his upbringing had given him tools for. He did not know what to make of the woman who had appeared in the cabin while the storm was still on. He knew what Dorothy Clay said about it because Dorothy had been saying it loudly enough that it was difficult to be in Millstone Creek on any Saturday and not know exactly what Dorothy Clay said about any given subject. He had repeated some of what he heard in the way that young men sometimes do when they are uncertain of their own opinion and so borrow someone else's. He was not proud of it. He would not have been able to articulate that he was not proud of it because reflection of that kind was not something he had practiced much. But somewhere in the back of him, in the place where the honest responses lived before they could be processed into something more manageable, he knew it was wrong, and the knowledge sat in him like a splinter he had not yet decided to do anything about. The morning of the 14th day after Grace arrived, he came into the barn before first light to find Bessie standing wrong. Bessie was the Morgan Ranch's best working mare, a bay with a white marking on her left foreleg that Caleb called her boot. She was 12 years old and had been Ellen's horse first, which gave her a status on the property that was not entirely rational, but was nonetheless real. She stood in the far corner of her stall with her head low and her ears back, her weight shifted in the particular way that meant something in the gut had gone wrong. Sam stood at the stall door and looked at her and felt the cold, specific dread of a man who knows what he is seeing and does not want to be seeing it. Bloat. The belly was tight and distended on the left side. She had not been moving, which was the worst sign. A horse that stopped moving with bloat was a horse that might not start again. He went to find Caleb. Caleb was at the woodpile. By the time they came back to the barn together, Grace was already there standing at the stall door in her work dress and apron with her arms crossed and her head tilted, looking at Bessie with the focused attention of someone conducting an examination. Sam looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Grace. "Gas colic," Grace said without turning around. "The gut is backed up. She needs to move." "You can't move her," Sam said. It came out sharper than he meant it to. "You move a horse with bloat like that, you risk the gut twisting. You could kill her." "You risk the gut twisting if she stands still," Grace said, still looking at Bessie. "Dr. Wesley kept 15 horses. I've handled this 6 times. The gas needs to move through. The only thing that moves it is walking." She turned then and looked at Sam with her gray eyes and her direct, uncomplicated expression. "I need lead rope and someone to hold her head steady for the first few minutes. After that, she'll lead herself when she realizes it's helping." Sam looked at Caleb. Caleb reached past him and took the lead rope from its hook on the barn wall. He handed it to Grace. Sam stood back and watched. He stood there for 3 hours off and on, while Grace walked Bessie in slow, patient circuits around the yard in the cold morning air, talking to the horse in the steady, low voice she used for things that needed calming, stopping to check the belly, and the breathing, adjusting the pace when needed. Reading the animal's responses with the kind of attention that came from practice and not from guessing. By mid-morning, Bessie's ears came up. By noon, she was moving with something closer to her usual purpose. By early afternoon, she had eaten a small measure of hay and was standing square on all 4 legs with her weight distributed evenly and her color back in her lips and gums. Sam Reeves did not say anything to Grace that afternoon. He went back to his work and said nothing. But that evening when he passed the barn on his way to the bunkhouse, he stopped and looked in at Bessie eating her hay in the lamplight, and he stood there for a moment with his hand on the top rail of the stall, and the splinter in him shifted. Not out, not yet, but it shifted. That evening with Lily fed and the dishes cleared, and the fire settled into its late evening steadiness, Caleb and Grace sat on opposite sides of the hearth in the familiar arrangement they had arrived at without negotiating, him on the straight-back chair, with his coffee, her in the armchair, with her knitting. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had not been uncomfortable for several days now. It had become the silence of 2 people who have learned that they can occupy the same space without either one of them having to fill it. Grace set down her needles. "I held him for 2 days, she said. She was looking at the fire when she said it, not at Caleb. "Henry, after he died, 2 full days before Dr. Ford came back." She paused. "I knew, by the end of the first day I knew, but I couldn't. She stopped. She picked the word with care. I couldn't stop. I didn't know how to do the next thing without first finishing this one. Caleb set his coffee down. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor between his boots for a moment. Then he looked up. Ellen said something, he said. At the end, she got hold of my hand and she said something. He stopped. From the cradle across the room, Lily made one small sound and settled back into sleep. Lily cried for the first time right at that moment. First sound she ever made. I turned toward it without thinking. The way you do. He was quiet for a moment. I never heard what Ellen said. I've thought about it every day since. What she was trying to tell me. The fire crackled between them. Outside the window, the night was still, the earlier wind having finally decided to rest. Maybe she said goodbye, Grace offered quietly. Maybe, Caleb said. Or maybe she was telling me something I needed to know. Something for after. He picked up his coffee again, found it cold, set it back down. I keep thinking I should have turned slower. Listen first. You turned toward your daughter, Grace said. That's what Ellen would have wanted. He looked at her across the fire. She was still looking at the flames, her knitting in her lap, her face open and unguarded in the way it became in the evenings when the day was done and there was nothing left to perform. Yes, he said, I think you're right. They sat in that for a while without needing to add anything to it. It was on the 21st night that Caleb opened the envelope. He had moved it from the desk to the drawer of his bedside table, and from there back to the desk twice. He had looked at it every evening when he sat down with the papers. He had touched it and set it aside and told himself he would deal with it when he was ready, and he had not been ready, and several evenings had passed this way. On the 21st night, he sat down at the desk after Grace had gone to her room, and he took the envelope out of the drawer, and he opened it. Ellen's handwriting filled a single page, the careful version, the version she used for things that mattered. He read it once quickly, the way you read something when part of you already knows what it says. Then he read it again slowly because the words deserved that from him. The letter was dated September 14th, 1878, 4 months before she died, 3 months before Lily was born. She had written to Patterson and Sons in Denver to request their services. She had explained the situation with a directness that was entirely Ellen without softening or apology. Dr. Ford had given her an honest accounting of the risk, she wrote. She had understood it, and she was not writing out of panic but out of practicality, which was the same thing she had always brought to every problem that presented itself. Caleb would not ask for help, she wrote. He would sit alone in that house with the baby, and he would work until he couldn't, and he would blame himself for everything that went wrong, and by the time he was willing to admit he needed assistance, the situation would have gone further than it needed to go. She knew him. She had known him for 11 years. She was not writing because she had given up hope of surviving. She was writing because she was realistic about probability, and she loved her husband and her child more than she valued the comfort of pretending bad outcomes were impossible. She described what she needed in simple terms. Not a housekeeper, not a caretaker. A woman with sense and backbone who could stand steady in the face of difficulty and who would be honest with Caleb without being unkind to him. A woman who understood that the most important things got shown rather than said. A woman who could find her footing in hard ground. The letter ended with a sentence that Caleb read 3 times the last time with his hand pressed flat over it as though to hold it still. She will not know I asked for her, she had written. He will not know either. But I will know, and that is enough. Caleb sat at the desk for a long time. This was the copy she had kept. The original had gone to Denver months ago in the careful and quiet way she had done most things she did not want to discuss until they were done. And yet a woman had come. He could not make the arithmetic of it add up to any particular conclusion. Grace had come because of Ralph Dunmore's advertisement, not because of Ellen's letter. Ellen's letter had never reached anyone. The connection between these two facts was nothing more than coincidence. If coincidence was even the right word for the way things sometimes arrange themselves in ways that seemed to exceed the reasonable. He folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment. He was not going to tell Grace about it. Not yet. She had her own weight to carry. He did not want to add to it the strange burden of being someone else's answered prayer when she was still trying to sort out what she was and where she belonged. He put the letter in the inside pocket of his jacket close to his chest, and he went to bed. The trouble from the outside world arrived as trouble often does on a fine day. The sun had actually come through properly that morning, the first genuinely warm day of the season, and Grace had taken Lily out to the porch in the afternoon to let the baby feel the light on her face for the first time. She was sitting in the rocker with Lily in her arms, Lily squinting and turning her head toward the warmth with the pleased, unfocused expression of an infant, discovering that the world contained more than she had previously been shown when the sound of hoofbeats on the main track brought her attention to the road. The man who rode in was not someone she recognized. He was riding a horse that cost more than most working horses in this part of Colorado, and he was wearing a suit that belonged in a city office rather than on a ranch track, and he carried himself with the particular combination of self-assurance and condescension that Grace had learned to read in her years of medical work as the default posture of men who had decided their position in life excused them from ordinary courtesy. He introduced himself as Silas Drummond. He said it in the way that people say names they expect to be recognized. Caleb had come around from the barn when he heard the horse. He stood in the yard with his arms at his sides and his face set in the neutral expression he kept for situations requiring patience. Silas Drummond. It emerged over coffee that Grace did not enjoy making and Caleb did not enjoy serving, was a lawyer from Denver. He was the cousin of Ralph Dunmore. He had come to Millstone Creek to handle the matter of Ralph's estate, which included the ranch, the cattle, the equipment, and what he referred to with a precise and practiced carefulness as outstanding contractual questions. He looked at Grace when he said the last part. He was pleasant about it. He was pleasant in the way of a man who has learned that pleasantness is a more effective tool than open hostility, and who has been using it long enough that it no longer required effort. He did not accuse her of anything. He simply made clear in the course of the conversation that Grace had no formal contractual claim to the Dunmore estate, because the agreement she had entered into with Ralph through the matchmaking agency had not been formalized through any document that carried legal weight, and therefore her situation with respect to that estate was legally speaking that of a stranger. "I understand that," Grace said. She kept her voice even. "I haven't made any claim." "Of course," Silas said with a smile that sat on his face without warming it. "I'm simply ensuring clarity for everyone's benefit." He turned to Caleb. "I also want to make sure you understand the implications of the current arrangement. A woman of uncertain status residing in the home of an unmarried man." He paused just long enough for the implication to settle into the room. In a community of this size, that kind of situation tends to generate questions. Questions that can sometimes find their way to the attention of people in official positions. He said it pleasantly. He said it the way a man says the thing he means when he does not want to be held accountable for meaning it. After Silas Drummond rode back down the track toward town, Caleb stood in the yard for a while. Grace stood on the porch with Lily against her shoulder and watched the road settle back to its ordinary emptiness. Neither of them spoke for a time. "He'll go to Judge Cole," Caleb said finally. "I know," Grace said. "He'll make it sound like whatever he needs it to sound like." "Yes." Caleb looked at the track where the dust from Silas's horse was still drifting. "I won't send you back to Dorothy Clay's." "I know that too," Grace said. She shifted Lily to her other shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded once, the same nod as always, the one that said what needed to be said, and went back to the barn. That Saturday, Grace walked into Millstone Creek for supplies. She had made this walk before twice, and she had understood each time that she was being observed. She was an outsider by every measure the town could apply. She was the woman who had come to marry Ralph Dunmore and now lived at the Morgan Ranch. And this fact was doing the work that such facts always did in small towns, passing from one person to the next, and gathering texture and implication at each exchange. She went to the mercantile for flour and salt and a paper of pins. The man behind the counter was polite. The two women at the far end of the store were not impolite. They simply spoke to each other at a volume that was pitched with some precision to carry. "Not 6 months since Ellen passed," one said. She was not looking at Grace. "And already," the other replied in a tone that contained everything the sentence chose not to complete. Grace set her purchases on the counter and paid for them and took them out to the wagon. She lifted the bags in and arranged them in the bed and stood for a moment with her hands on the side rail of the wagon looking at the street. A door opened across the way, and Dorothy Clay came out of the boarding house carrying a basket, and behind her, unhurried and at his ease, came Silas Drummond. He caught Grace's eye and lifted his hat to her with a courtesy that was perfectly calibrated to be an insult by being nothing more than courtesy. She climbed up to the wagon seat and drove home. That evening, she told Caleb nothing about it. There was nothing productive in the telling. She simply sat with Lily for longer than usual before putting her down, and when she came to the fireside, she did not pick up her knitting. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire, and after a while, Caleb, without making a point of it, added another log and handed her a cup of tea that she had not asked for, and she took it. It was 2 days later that Grace found the letter. She had been reorganizing the bottom of her traveling bag, the kind of task that gets deferred through weeks of more pressing necessity and finally gets done on a quiet morning when the hands need something to do. The bag had a cloth lining stitched in at the bottom, meant to add structure, and it had developed a small fold in the lining during the journey that created a narrow pocket against the leather base. She had known the fold was there. She had not thought much about it. When she pulled the lining flat to smooth the fold, the envelope came out. She sat very still on the edge of her cot and looked at it. It was a business envelope, the kind used for formal correspondence. The return address read, Patterson and Sons, Denver, Colorado. Her own name and the Dunmore Ranch, Millstone Creek, Colorado. The only address in this part of the world she had known to give at the time. She had never opened this one. She remembered now dimly that it had arrived the week before she left Columbus, and she had put it in the bag, meaning to read it on the train, and then Henry had arrived on the train, and everything that came before Henry's arrival had receded into a part of her memory that she had not revisited since. She opened it. It was a letter of confirmation from the agency, the routine administrative correspondence that accompanied the finalization of an arrangement. It thanked her for her participation and confirmed the details of her placement, and in the second paragraph, where the name of her intended should have appeared, she read 3 words that made her stop breathing for a moment. C. Morgan, Millstone Creek Ranch. She read it again. The letter explained in the careful and slightly impersonal language of administrative correspondence that her file had originally been processed in conjunction with a request received from the Morgan property in Millstone Creek, received in October of 1878. Due to the requester's subsequent failure to confirm the arrangement, and due to a parallel advertisement placed by Ralph Dunmore in the same territory, the agency had transferred her file to the Dunmore placement as a courtesy pending resolution. The original requesting party, listed as C. Morgan Millstone Creek Ranch, had never followed up. Requesting party, C. Morgan, Millstone Creek Ranch. Grace sat with the letter in her hands and thought. C. Morgan, not Caleb. She knew Caleb well enough by now to know with absolute certainty that this letter and the arrangement it described had not originated with him. He would sooner have let the ranch fall down around him than written to a matchmaking agency. That was as certain as anything she knew about him. C. Morgan, Ellen Claire Morgan, who had gone by her middle name with the people who knew her best, according to the note Caleb had made, without realizing he made it the evening he told her about Ellen's habit of humming, while she worked, about how she signed her letters to her sister with a looping C that her sister had teased her about for 20 years. Ellen Morgan had written to Patterson and Sons in Denver. Ellen Morgan, who had known she might not survive, and who had thought about what came after with the same clear-eyed practicality she apparently brought to everything, had requested a woman for this household, had described what was needed, had set in motion from whatever dark foreknowledge had moved her hand across the page, a chain of events that had ended with Grace Alderton standing in a winter storm on a ranch porch with a letter that had been kited across her journey and lost for months and was only now finding her. She had come to Millstone Creek for Ralph Dunmore. She had been sent to Millstone Creek for Caleb Morgan. Or rather, she had been sent by someone who was no longer here to be thanked, or argued with someone who had looked at the problem of her husband and her child with love and practicality in equal measure and had done what she could. Grace sat for a long time on the edge of the narrow cot in the east-facing room that caught the morning light. She thought about what it meant. She thought about what to do with it. She thought about how Caleb would receive it, whether he would believe her. Whether, even if he believed her, it would feel to him like calculation rather than accident, like a woman using a dead wife's letter as legal standing. She folded the letter and put it at the bottom of the bag beneath the smoothed lining. She was not ready. The timing was wrong, and the ground between them was still being established, and she would know when it was right and it was not yet. She went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on and started breakfast. 3 days later, Silas Drummond appeared in Millstone Creek's main street with a purpose he had spent those 3 days carefully preparing. He had spent time in the saloon, in the mercantile, at the barber's chair, in the places where the information a town holds about itself gets shared and circulated. He was good at this. He had been a lawyer long enough to know that what happens in a courtroom is often decided before anyone walks through the door. He spoke to people individually, never in groups. He was careful never to state anything that could be directly contradicted. He asked questions, he raised concerns, he expressed with genuine-sounding regret that there were certain aspects of Mrs. Alderton's history in Columbus that he had become aware of in the course of his administrative work for the Dunmore estate, certain matters that were perhaps not his place to discuss, but that a responsible man in his position could not entirely ignore. He said the word investigation, just once, just in passing, to just 2 people. By the end of the week, it had reached 8. Judge Warren Cole was a man of 60 who had been administering the law in this district for 14 years, and who had arrived at a late career philosophy that might be summarized as follows. The law was clear. Human situations were complicated, and the job of a judge was to hold those 2 facts in tension without letting either one destroy the other. He was not a cruel man. He was not a venal one. He was a man who had seen enough of human difficulty to be slow to judgment, and who had also seen enough of human capacity for self-serving interpretation to be careful about what he allowed sentiment to excuse. He sent word to the Morgan Ranch by way of Dr. Ford, which was the most considerate way he could manage it. The morning of the hearing, Grace put on her best dress, which was a dark blue wool she had worn to church in Columbus, and which was slightly too formal for this purpose, but was the most unimpeachable thing she owned. She brushed her hair and wound it up properly and pinned it. She checked her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand in her room and looked at herself steadily for a moment, making an honest assessment. Then she went out to the wagon where Caleb was waiting. He was wearing his church clothes. He had shaved, which he did not always do on days that were not Sunday. He helped her up to the wagon seat without making anything of it, and they drove into town in the early morning with Lily in the basket between them, all 3 of them quiet. Judge Cole's office smelled of paper and old wood, and the particular closed window smell of a room where serious things had been said for many years. He sat behind his desk and looked at them both with the kind of attention that withholds judgment while gathering information. Silas Drummond was there, which Grace had expected. Dorothy Clay was there, which she had also expected, sitting in the chair to the left of the door, with her back straight and her hands folded, and her expression that of a woman performing civic duty at some personal inconvenience. Cole spoke plainly, which Grace appreciated. The concern, he said, was the welfare of a child in an ambiguous household situation. The concern was not the character of either party, which he was not in a position to adjudicate on the available evidence. The concern was the question of stability, an established arrangement which the law required him to be able to point to in a clear and definable way. If the current situation was not formalized within 30 days, he would be required to revisit the question of Lily's placement. The word placement sat in the room like a stone dropped in water. Caleb's voice when he spoke was level. My daughter is alive because this woman walked 2 miles in a winter storm to feed her. She was dying. She is not dying anymore. He paused. That's all the formalization I need. I understand that, Cole said. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. But the law requires more than I need, Mr. Morgan. I'm sorry. Outside on the street afterward, the morning had warmed up properly. The sun was on the storefronts, and the smell of mud and early grass was in the air. Grace stood by the wagon with Lillian, looked at the street, and said nothing. Caleb stood beside her and also said nothing for a while. Then he said, We have 30 days. Yes, that's enough time. She looked at him. He was looking at the street, not at her. His jaw set in the angle she had learned meant he was working out a problem that he was not yet ready to discuss. Enough time for what? She asked. He turned and helped her up to the wagon seat without answering. It was 10 days after the hearing when Sam Reeves's voice carried across the yard in the dark. Caleb was on the porch in the evening, working on a piece of harness and with a needle and thread, when Sam and one of the day laborers rode back from the far pasture along the track that ran past the south side of the property. He could hear them before he could see them the way sounds carry at dusk in clear air. He was not trying to listen. He simply heard. Hear the widow's nursing more than the baby up there, one voice said. The other laughed. Caleb sat very still, with the harness in his hands. The sound of the horses faded past and down the track and was gone. He sat there for a long time after that. The needle and thread were still in his hands. He did not put them down or keep working. He simply sat in the growing dark with the harness across his knees, and the words turned in him, and he did not do anything with what they made him feel because there was nothing useful to do with it at this particular moment. Eventually, he went inside. Grace was in the armchair with Lily, and she looked up when he came through the door. She read something in his face with the quickness she had for reading faces, the trained attention of a woman who had spent years assessing patients who were not always honest about what was wrong. She did not ask. They did not speak that evening, not about anything that mattered. But Grace had been near the kitchen window with it open for the evening air when Sam and the other man rode past, and sound travels the same for everyone. She lay in her narrow bed that night and stared at the ceiling and let the words do their work on her. She was practiced at not flinching. She had developed this skill over years of being in situations where flinching was not useful, and she could hold still in the face of almost anything while it was happening. It was only afterward, in the dark and alone, that she felt what she felt. Silas Drummond made his final move on a Thursday. He had gathered through his various conversations enough of a story to assemble something that sounded in the telling like a coherent history: the death of Thomas Alderton, the questions that had briefly surrounded it, the fact that Grace had left Columbus before the official resolution of those questions, which was true, and which he framed in the way that true things are sometimes framed, so that the framing carries an implication the facts themselves do not quite support. He presented this to the group he had most carefully cultivated over the preceding weeks, the core of what he understood to be the town's informal authority on matters of community character. Dorothy Clay was among them. Several others whose names Grace did not know, but whose faces she had seen in the mercantile in the street. Dr. Ford heard about it by the end of the same day. He came to the ranch the following morning and told Grace directly because he was the kind of man who believed that people deserved to hear the truth from someone who was on their side rather than from someone who was not. Grace listened to all of it. She thanked him. She watched him ride back down the track. Then she went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while. She had been a suspect. For 3 weeks after Thomas died, in the immediate chaos of the investigation into the explosion, she had been questioned along with everyone else who had been near the facility that day, along with every widow and family member who had a reason to want answers and who was therefore also, by the uncharitable logic of official inquiry, a candidate for having caused what they were grieving. It had been horrifying, and it had been temporary, and it had resolved in the way that the truth eventually resolves when someone with authority bothers to follow it to its end. Frederick Crane had been cutting corners on maintenance for 2 years. The boiler had been documented as failing. There had been a paper trail that the investigators eventually found, and when they found it, the question of Grace's involvement had been disposed of in a single sentence in the official report. She had been on the train to Colorado by then. She had left Columbus in January, before the investigation concluded, and she had not looked back because there was nothing to look back toward, and because the investigation, as far as she had understood it at the time, was still ongoing and might go in any direction, and she had not wanted to wait in the city where she had watched her husband die to find out which. She had not known the outcome. The thought of this sat on her now with a particular weight, the strange and crushing irony of a woman who had fled from something that had already been resolved, who had spent months carrying a shame that had already been lifted, who had been standing in her own absolution without knowing it, while Silas Drummond used the empty outline of the situation she had escaped to cut her down. She picked up her work apron from the hook by the door and tied it on, and began preparing dinner because the evening was coming, and Lily would need feeding, and Caleb would need to eat, and the day kept going regardless of what happened inside a person while it was going. She did not tell Caleb any of it. But that night, with the fire low and the house settled into its late evening quiet, she sat in the armchair and looked at the fire and felt the accumulated weight of it, the gossip and the judgment and the official threat and the borrowed shame of a crime that had never been hers. And she thought about the woman she had been when she left Columbus, the practical and forward-facing woman who had decided that the next chapter was out there somewhere and that the way to find it was to move toward it. She looked at Lily in the cradle. She thought about Dorothy Clay's voice through a boarding house window. About the women in the mercantile who spoke to each other at a volume precisely calibrated to wound. About Silas Drummond's pleasant smile and his careful, poisonous sentences. About Sam Reeves in the dark on the road. She thought about what it meant to stay somewhere you did not, by the strict accounting of others, belong. She thought about all of this for a long time. And then in the small hours of the morning, when the fire had gone to coals and the house was entirely still, she did something she had not fully decided to do until the moment she was doing it. She rose from the chair, she went to the cradle, and she stood over Lily for a moment, watching her breathe. Then she lifted her carefully, the baby's head against her shoulder, and she wrapped the heavy blanket around them both, and she took her coat from the hook by the back door. She did not tell herself she was leaving. She could not have said later exactly what she was telling herself in those minutes. The thinking had stopped being useful, and something else had taken over, something that was not rational. Exactly, something more like a body deciding for itself what it needed when the mind had run out of answers. She opened the back door and went out into the night. The cold was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that comes after a long thaw, a reminder that the season had not finished asserting itself. The sky was enormous and crowded with stars. The yard was silver and still under that light. Lily stirred against her shoulder and made a small sound, and Grace pressed her lips to the baby's head and kept walking. She walked past the woodpile and past the chicken coop and past the corner of the barn where the shadow fell deepest, and she kept walking toward the track that led to the main road, her boots loud on the frozen mud, and then quieter when she reached the grass at the edge of the yard. She was not thinking clearly. She knew this and did not know how to stop it. She was thinking only in feelings, and the feelings where they are right. I do not belong here. I have put this man and his daughter in the middle of a storm. That is my fault for arriving. I should go somewhere that my being there does not cost the people inside. I just wanted to help, she said into the dark to Lily, to no one. Her voice came out small and shaking in the cold air. That's all. I just wanted to help. Lily's hands found the collar of her coat and gripped. Inside the cabin, Caleb woke up. He woke the way he had woken every night since Ellen died, at some small sound or change in the air, his body unwilling to commit fully to sleep for longer than an hour at a stretch. He lay still for a moment, listening. Then he sat up. Something was different in the house. He did not know what it was. He could not have named it. But he had lived in this house long enough to know the sounds it made when it was resting, and the sounds it did not make when something had changed, and what he was hearing now was a wrong silence. He got up. He went to Lily's room. The cradle was empty. The blanket was gone. He went to Grace's room. The room was empty. Her coat was not on its hook. He pulled on his jacket and his boots and went out the front door at a pace that was not quite running, because running was what you did when you already knew something was wrong beyond the possibility of it being otherwise, and he was not yet ready to know that. He called her name. The dark swallowed it. He called again, louder, and then he moved around the side of the house to where he could see the yard and the track beyond it. He saw her. She was standing at the edge of the track, maybe 100 yards from the house, not moving, just standing in the starlight, with Lily against her shoulder. She was not walking anymore. She had stopped, and she was just standing there in the cold dark, and he was not sure she knew he could see her. He went to her. She turned when she heard his boots on the frozen ground, and when she turned, he could see her face in the starlight, and it looked like the face of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time, and has finally set it down in the wrong place and does not know how to pick it up again. I thought maybe I should go, she said. Her voice was very steady and very tired. The things they're saying, the trouble it's making for you, for Lily. She looked down at the baby against her shoulder. I thought maybe the right thing was for me to stop being the reason for it. Caleb stood in front of her in the cold dark, close enough that she could see his face clearly. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man choosing words to soften something. The quiet of a man choosing words because he meant them, and meant them exactly. You walked 2 miles in a storm, he said, for a child you had never met. You sat in a barn for 3 hours walking my horse because you knew how and it needed doing. You have been here every morning before I was, and you have been here every evening after, and you have not once asked me for anything you didn't need. She started to say something. He kept going. You didn't take Lily from me. You gave her back to me. His voice came out lower on that last sentence, lower and less controlled, and he did not try to fix it. The talk in this town is not your fault. It's the fault of people who have decided that something that looks different from what they're used to must be something wrong. That's on them. He paused. And it's on me for not making the situation clearer before now. She looked at him. In the starlight, her eyes were gray and direct and wet. Caleb, she started. Come inside, he said. She looked at the dark track behind her for a moment, the road that led to town and to what waited there, the road she had been walking toward without a destination in mind. Then she looked at the house behind him, the lamp still burning in the front window, where he had left it, the light coming warm through the glass into the cold air. She followed him inside. He built the fire back up while she settled Lily, and when she came back to the main room, he had her chair pulled closer to the hearth, and there was tea on the table beside it, made in the time it had taken her to put Lily down. She sat. He sat across from her in his own chair and looked at the fire for a while. Then he said without looking at her, I'm going to ride into town in the morning. There are some things that need to be made clear. She nodded. She understood what he meant, or she thought she did. Neither of them said anything more that night. But in the morning before Grace was up, Caleb Morgan saddled his horse and rode into Millstone Creek in the cold early light, and he knocked on the door of Judge Warren Cole's house at an hour that was not a social hour. And when Cole opened the door in his housecoat with a lamp in his hand, Caleb told him what he had come to say. He told the judge that he was filing notice of intention to marry Grace Alderton, and that the 30 days had therefore already resolved itself, and that he wanted this noted in the official record before anything else was filed, said, or decided about the situation at his ranch. Cole looked at him for a moment over the lamp. You know what you're saying, Cole said. Yes, Caleb said. Cole nodded slowly. Come in then. I'll get the book. Caleb stood in the hallway of the judge's house while Cole found the register, and he thought about Ellen's letter in his jacket pocket, which he had been carrying every day for 3 weeks now, like something he was not yet ready to put down. He thought about a woman standing in the dark at the edge of the track with a baby against her shoulder and her face like someone who had been told one too many times that she did not belong where she was standing. He thought about what Ellen would have said if she had been there to say it. He thought she would have said, "It's about time." He signed the paper that Cole put in front of him, and he rode home. Grace found the note when she came to the kitchen in the morning. It was folded once and set on the table beside the coffee pot, which was warm, which meant Caleb had been up before she had, which was unusual. She had always been the earlier riser. She stood in the kitchen in her work dress, and her braided hair still coming properly together, and she looked at the note before she picked it up the way you look at something when you already half know what it says and need a moment before the knowing becomes certain. His handwriting was what it was, large and uneven and blunt on the page, the handwriting of a man who used a pen rarely enough that each use felt like an imposition. I have gone to see Judge Cole. I have filed notice of intention to marry. The 30 days are settled. If you do not want this, tell me when I return and we will find another arrangement. But I wanted you to know before you heard it some other way. She set the note back down on the table. She poured herself coffee and stood by the window and looked out at the yard where the morning light was coming in low and pale across the frost-stiffened grass. Lily was still asleep. The house was quiet around her in the particular way of a house that has had someone moving through it recently, the coffee warmth still in the air, the faint evidence of a presence just departed. She thought about the letter from Patterson and Sons at the bottom of her bag. She thought about the window she had been standing at when she decided with more certainty than she had yet admitted to herself that she was not going back to Dorothy Clay's boarding house, and she was not going back to Columbus, and she was not, when it came down to it, going anywhere at all. She had made that decision without examining it closely, the way you sometimes make the most important decisions, by arriving at them from the inside and finding them already there. She finished the coffee. She went to her room and took the letter from the bottom of her bag and put it in the pocket of her apron, and she went to check on Lily. The baby was awake, lying on her back in the cradle, looking at the ceiling with the focused, puzzled attention of a child who finds the ceiling a more reliable subject of contemplation than the complicated world below it. When Grace's face appeared above the cradle's rim, Lily's arms came up immediately, both of them reaching with the emphatic and unconditional demand of a child who has recently learned that reaching works. Grace lifted her. She stood at the window of Lily's room with the baby against her shoulder and looked out at the morning and let herself feel without immediately cataloging or organizing what she felt. It was a large and complicated feeling. It had grief in it and something that was not quite grief. It had the particular ache of things you have wanted without letting yourself know you wanted them. It had the careful, tentative quality of trust that has been earned through difficulty and is therefore more solid than the kind that comes easily. It had underneath all of it the thing she had stopped herself from naming until now. She was still standing there when she heard Caleb's horse in the yard. He came in quietly the way he always came in from outdoors, stopping at the threshold to knock the mud from his boots before crossing the kitchen floor. She came out of Lily's room with the baby on her hip, and they looked at each other across the length of the kitchen. "Judge Cole sends his regards," Caleb said. He was working to keep his voice neutral and not entirely succeeding. "Did he make you stand in the hallway?" Grace asked. "He made me stand in the hallway." "How long?" "Long enough that I started counting the boards in the floor." She almost smiled. She let herself almost smile, which was as much as the moment seemed to require. "I need to show you something," she said. "Sit down." He sat at the table. She passed Lily to him, which he accepted with the unself-conscious ease of a man who has been holding an infant for 2 months and has crossed the line from awkward to fluent without noticing when it happened. She went to her room and came back with the letter. She set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He read the return address. He picked it up and read it through once, then again, and she watched his face while he read it the second time and saw the moment when the implications of it arrived in him, the slight change around the eyes, the stillness that came down over his expression like a shade being drawn. He set the letter down. He sat there for a moment without speaking. Then he pushed his chair back and stood up, and he went to the row of coat hooks by the door and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, which was hanging there, and he came back to the table with something else. He set Ellen's letter beside the Patterson letter on the table between them. "Read the last line," he said. She read it. "She will not know I asked for her. He will not know either. But I will know. And that is enough." Grace sat with both letters in front of her for a long time. The fire crackled. Lily made a content, exploratory sound and reached for Caleb's shirt button with both hands. "She wrote it in September," Caleb said, 4 months before she died. "She knew the risk and she planned for it." He paused. "She never sent it. I found it in with the household papers." He looked at the table rather than at Grace. "I didn't know if it was the same agency. I still don't know if the Patterson letter came because of Ellen, or if it came because of the Dunmore arrangement and whatever overlap the agency had in this territory. I don't know which." "Does it matter?" Grace said quietly. He thought about it. "No," he said. "I don't think it does." "She described something," Grace said, "in her letter, the kind of person she was looking for." "Yes. I don't know if I'm that person." He looked up, then directly at her, the way he looked at him things when he was being precise and honest. "I know you are," he said. "I've known for a while." The morning held that between them for a moment, simple and clear as the light coming through the kitchen window. "You filed the notice," Grace said, "before you knew about my letter." "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was choosing words, because they mattered. "Because you were standing at the edge of the track in the dark with my daughter, and your face looked like someone who had been told one too many times that they were in the wrong place." He looked back down at the table. "Because Ellen was right, about what I needed, about what Lily needed. And I am not going to pretend I don't know something true just because admitting it makes me uncertain." Grace looked at the two letters side by side on the table, one in Ellen Morgan's careful hand, and one in the businesslike type of an agency in Denver, both of them pointing in the same direction, arriving by different roads at the same address. "She was a good woman," Grace said. "The best I've known," Caleb said. Then he looked up again. "Until recently." Grace pressed her lips together. She took the Patterson letter back and folded it and held it in her hands. She thought about a woman in September who had known what was coming and had sat down and done the practical and loving thing, the thing that required believing in the future more than in the present, and how that woman was not here to see what her practicality and her love had made possible. "I have something else to tell you," Grace said. "About Columbus." She told him all of it. The investigation and the questions and the awful suspended weeks of being looked at sideways by official eyes that were looking for something to find. The departure before the resolution. The fear that had moved her feet faster than her thinking, the certainty that she could not wait in that city where Thomas had died to find out which way an official inquiry would land. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, she said, "I don't know how the matter resolved. I left before it did. Silas Drummond found the unresolved part and used it, and there was nothing I could say to counter him because I genuinely did not know the outcome." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dr. Ford gets the Columbus papers. He orders them for the medical journals, but they send the whole edition." He stood up. "He keeps back issues in his office. Has for years." She looked at him. "I'll ask him to look," Caleb said. He rode to town that afternoon. He was back before the light changed. He came through the kitchen door and set a folded section of newsprint on the table in front of Grace without saying anything first because the saying was in the paper and not in him. She unfolded it. It was the Columbus Dispatch dated November 1878, third page, second column, halfway down. She found it because her eye knew what to look for, the way your eye always finds your own name in a page of text. The headline was narrow and factual in the way of newspaper writing that is reporting a resolution rather than a drama. Crane convicted in Steelworks disaster. 12 counts. The article was 3 paragraphs. In the second paragraph, her name appeared once in a subordinate clause, in the passive construction of things that require acknowledgement, but not emphasis. Surviving spouses and associates previously questioned, including one Grace Alderton, were cleared of any connection to the incident. She read it twice. She had been cleared in November. She had been on the train to Colorado in January, carrying Henry, believing herself to be fleeing the unresolved judgment of an official inquiry that had by then already been resolved. She had spent 4 months in Millstone Creek under the shadow of something that had already lifted. She had carried it every day through Dorothy Clay's narrow north-facing room, and through the loss of Henry, and through the storm, and all the weeks after the borrowed shame of something that had already been returned. She set the paper down. She pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood for a moment. "I could have gone back," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. She looked up at him. "Do you want me to?" He looked at her steadily. "No." She nodded once. A breath went out of her, slow and complete, the exhalation of something she had been holding without quite knowing the shape of it. "Then I won't," she said. What happened in the saloon on the following Thursday was witnessed by 11 men and reported to at least 30 more by the end of the same evening, so that the account of it became, within the week, one of those pieces of common knowledge that small towns hold as shared property, retold with minor variations, but consistent in its essential facts. Silas Drummond had been in the saloon since mid-afternoon. He was a man who knew how to be comfortable in a place that was not his own, who could make a borrowed stool and a glass of whiskey feel like a professional arrangement. And he had spent the hours doing what he had spent the past several weeks doing, which was the careful and patient work of shaping the way a community understood a situation. He was not doing anything in the strict sense that could be directly objected to. He was talking to men he had come to know over his weeks in Millstone Creek. He was sharing information in the form of questions and concerns, and the occasional observation offered with the air of reluctant civic obligation. The door opened and Caleb Morgan walked in. Silas saw him come in. He acknowledged him with the nod of one man recognizing another in a public space and returned his attention to his glass. Caleb crossed the room and stood at the bar for a moment. He ordered coffee, which got him one sideways look from the bartender, who produced it without comment. He turned and leaned his back against the bar and looked at the room. He waited until Silas had finished whatever sentence he was in the middle of. Then he spoke, and he spoke at a volume that was ordinary and unperformed, the volume of a man saying something he means in the place where he happens to be standing. "I want to make something clear," he said. He was not looking at Silas specifically. He was addressing the room the way a man addresses a room when he is making something a matter of record rather than argument. "Silas Drummond came to Millstone Creek to settle the estate of his cousin Ralph Dunmore. That's his right and his business, and I have no quarrel with it." The room was quiet now, the way rooms get quiet when they understand that something worth listening to is happening. "What is not his business," Caleb continued in the same level voice, "is Grace Alderton, Mrs. Alderton did not come to Millstone Creek for Ralph Dunmore. She came for my ranch. That's documented, and Judge Cole has seen the documentation, and any question about her legal standing in this community was settled when I filed notice of intention to marry her 3 days ago. He set the coffee cup down on the bar behind him. The matter in Columbus that Mr. Drummond has been discussing is also settled. It was settled in November of last year, when the man responsible for the explosion at the steelworks was convicted and Mrs. Alderton was cleared of any connection to it. Dr. Ford has the newspaper that says so, and anyone who wants to read it is welcome to ask him. He looked at Silas now directly, without hostility and without deference, the look of a man who has said what he has said and is not going to unsay it and is not particularly interested in the response. "I won't tell anyone what to think," he said. "I never have, and I don't intend to start. But I will tell you what I know. I know that woman walked 2 miles in a winter storm for my daughter when my daughter was dying. I know she has been at my ranch every morning since then before I am and every evening after, and that Lily is alive and strong and will know this spring and this summer and many more spring and summers because of that. I know that Grace Alderton is the finest person I have encountered in a very long time." He pushed off from the bar. "That's all," he said. He walked toward the door. From the corner table, a chair scraped back. Sam Reeves stood up. Sam was not a man who spoke publicly. He was not a man who, by his own assessment or anyone else's, had anything particular to say that other people needed to hear. He was 28 years old and had spent most of his adult life doing physical work in outdoor spaces and had not practiced the kind of conversation that happened in front of an audience. He stood up anyway. "I said things," Sam said. His voice came out rough, not from emotion exactly, but from the unaccustomed exertion of saying what he meant without the cover of the dark in the road, and the assumption that no one who mattered was listening. "About Mrs. Alderton. Couple weeks back, riding back from the south pasture. Said things I wouldn't want said about someone I cared about." He paused. He was looking at the table in front of him, rather than at the room, which was the only way he could get through it. "She heard. She didn't say anything about it. Next morning, she saved my horse, Bessie. Would have lost her. Mrs. Alderton spent 3 hours walking that horse in the cold because she knew how and because she knew it was the right thing to do." He looked up then toward the door that Caleb had already passed through. "That's all I've got to say. I just wanted it said." He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Dr. Ford, who had been sitting in the far corner with a glass of water and the expression of a man who has been waiting patiently for the world to demonstrate that it is on balance better than it sometimes appears, set his glass down. "I'll second both of those testimonials," he said, "and I'll add that I have known Mrs. Alderton since she arrived in this town in January, and I have watched her conduct herself through a series of circumstances that would have broken many people of either sex, and she has not broken, and she has not complained, and she has not asked for anything that was not earned." He stood up from his chair, which was his way of punctuating a statement that was now finished. "The Columbus newspaper is in my office. Anyone who wants to read it, come by in the morning." He put on his hat and walked out. The room held what it held for a moment, the residue of things said that cannot be unsaid, the slight but permanent rearrangement of a space after something real has moved through it. Silas Drummond sat at his table and looked at his whiskey glass and said nothing because there was nothing left worth saying. He left Millstone Creek 2 days later. Before he left, he came to the Morgan Ranch in the morning. Grace was on the porch with Lily when he rode up, and she watched him come without changing her expression. Caleb came around from the barn when he heard the horse and stood in the yard. Silas dismounted. He was still dressed, still carrying himself with the same city office authority, but there was something different in the set of it now, as though the internal framework that held the posture in place had shifted slightly. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope. He looked at it for a moment. Then he held it out toward Grace. "My cousin wrote this before he passed," he said. "I found it when I cleared the house. I read it." He paused. "I should have given it to you when I arrived." He held it until she took it. Then he turned and mounted his horse and rode back down the track without looking back, and the dust from his horse's feet settled behind him, and that was the last of Silas Drummond in Millstone Creek. Grace looked at the envelope, Ralph Dunmore's handwriting, which she had never seen, but which looked, she thought, like the handwriting of the letters she had received in Columbus. Clear and careful and a little deliberate, she opened it. She read it once on the porch with Lily against her hip and the morning sun coming in low and warm across the yard. Ralph had known. He had known his heart was unreliable in the way that some men know a thing without being told it, by the quality of certain mornings, by the way certain efforts cost more than they used to. He had written the letter sometime in the months before he died because it was the kind of practical accounting he apparently felt obligated to make. He asked Silas to treat the woman who came from Columbus well if he was not there to receive her himself. He expressed that he had hoped to give her a decent life and regretted that circumstances had made that impossible. He said that a person who had answered an honest advertisement deserved honest treatment in return, whatever the logistics of the situation required. And he ended with a single sentence that Grace read 3 times standing on the porch in the warming air. "She deserves a good man," he wrote. "This is good country. There are good men in it. Please see that she has the chance to find one." She folded the letter. She looked at Caleb, who was watching her from the yard with the careful attention of a man who wants to ask how things are and has decided to wait and be told. "He was a kind man," she said. Caleb nodded. "He was. He asked Silas to help me find a good man." She looked at the letter and then back at him. "The timing is a little late, but I think the spirit of it is satisfied." Something moved across Caleb's face that she had not seen there before or had seen in glimpses quickly hidden. He looked away out toward the far pasture where the cattle moved as slow dark shapes against the brightening grass. "I think so too," he said. Dr. Ford received a letter from a colleague in Columbus 2 weeks later in response to the inquiry he had made through professional channels. The letter confirmed what the newspaper article had reported. Frederick Crane had been convicted on 12 counts. All surviving parties previously under inquiry had been officially cleared. The matter was closed and had been closed since November. He brought the letter to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon and sat at the kitchen table with Grace, while Caleb was in the far pasture and Lily slept in the next room, and he read it aloud in his careful, unhurried way. And when he finished, he set it on the table and looked at her. "You never have to explain yourself on this account to anyone," he said. "Not in this town, not anywhere." Grace looked at the letter on the table. "I know that," she said. "I knew it before the letter, but it matters having the paper." She paused. "It matters to be able to show someone what the truth is instead of just asking them to believe it." Ford nodded. He understood that. He had been a doctor long enough to know the difference between what was true and what was documented, and the very real ways in which those two things could fail to match. He folded the letter and left it with her and rode back to town, and Grace sat at the kitchen table for a while after he left, looking at the place on the table where it had lain, thinking about November in Columbus, about a piece of paper produced in a room she had never been in that had disposed of her in a subordinate clause and moved on while she had been in Colorado, not knowing she had already been released. She picked up her knitting and went to sit on the porch in the afternoon sun. The wedding happened on a Saturday morning in the 3rd week of April, on a day when the sky had finally committed to blue and the cottonwoods along the creek showed the first soft gray-green of new leaves, and the air carried for the first time this season the actual warmth of a sun that meant to stay. Grace wore her dark blue wool dress, the church dress from Columbus, which was not a wedding dress and did not pretend to be, but was the best thing she owned and fit her well, and was the color of the sky on the morning she was wearing it. She put up her hair with particular care. She stood at the small mirror above the washstand in her east-facing room and looked at herself with the direct assessing attention she brought to most things. She looked like a woman who had survived a considerable amount and intended to keep going. She thought that was sufficient. Judge Cole came, and Dr. Ford and his wife Margaret, who brought a cake she had baked the evening before and had been transporting carefully in a covered tin. Sam Reeves appeared at the kitchen door 20 minutes before the ceremony, with his hat in both hands and his good shirt on a shirt Grace had not known he owned, and stood there in the doorway in the uncertain posture of a man who knows he was not explicitly invited and is not sure whether this constitutes a problem. Caleb looked at him for a moment from across the kitchen. "You're late," he said. "I know it," Sam said. "I had trouble with the hat." He held it up briefly by way of evidence. Caleb stepped back from the door, and Sam came in, and that was the end of the question. Caleb stood in the main room in a white shirt Grace had not seen before, which suggested he had acquired it recently and specifically, and his good dark trousers and his hair had been combed with an attention to detail that bore marks of significant effort. He looked like a man who was trying to rise to an occasion, and was not entirely certain of the result. Grace came out of her room with Lily on her hip, and he turned when he heard her, and whatever uncertainty had been in his expression resolved into something quieter and more settled. Judge Cole cleared his throat and opened the register. He read the words that the occasion required in his unhurried judicial voice. Outside, a light wind moved through the new cottonwood leaves. Lily and Grace's arms watched the proceedings with the focused and somewhat skeptical attention of an infant who has not yet determined what to make of adults gathering in rooms and speaking in formal tones. Cole asked Caleb if he took Grace Alderton as his wife. Caleb looked at her directly in the way he looked at things when he wanted to be precise. "I've taken her as that since the night she came to the door," he said. "This is just the paperwork." Cole permitted himself a small expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. He turned to Grace. "And do you take Caleb Morgan as your husband?" She shifted Lily to her other hip. She looked at Caleb. She thought about Columbus and a train moving west through the gray plains of a January afternoon. She thought about a platform in the cold and a piece of paper in an envelope and a north-facing room in a boarding house and the particular weight of sorrow carried alone across a long winter. She thought about 2 miles of frozen road and a door in the dark and a child who had stopped crying. "I came to Millstone Creek with milk and grief," she said. "He gave me a place to put both of them down." She paused. "Yes, I do," Cole wrote in the register. Ford's wife made a small sound that she converted with some effort into clearing her throat. Sam Reeves looked at the wall across the room with focused intensity, as though the pattern of the boards had become suddenly and urgently interesting. Caleb reached out and took Grace's free hand, the one that was not holding Lily, and held it in both of his for a moment. His hands were rough and warm, and she felt the familiar weight and texture of them, the hands that had built fences and chopped wood and carried a baby through 2 months of helpless fear, the hands that had set a cup of tea on the table beside her chair without being asked. She held on. After the ceremony, Cole shook Caleb's hand and kissed Grace's cheek with the formal courtesy of his generation, and Ford's wife cut the cake, and Sam Reeves ate 2 pieces and complimented it with an earnestness that appeared genuine, and therefore was, and then they went home one by one, until it was just the 3 of them in the quiet house with the afternoon sun coming through the windows and the cake on the table, and the register closed somewhere in Cole's office with 2 names on the same line. That evening, Caleb sat on the porch steps in the long spring light, and Grace sat on the top step with Lily asleep against her shoulder, and the valley below the ranch lay green and wide in the ending of the day. The creek shone where the light caught it. The new leaves on the cottonwoods moved. "Ellen used to sit here in the evenings," Caleb said. It was the first time he had said her name in Grace's presence, without something careful around it, some protective framing. He said it the way you say the name of someone who is not here, but is not absent either, who has settled into a permanent and particular place in the household of memory. "I know," Grace said. She did not say how she knew. She knew from the way the chair on the porch had been positioned, from the way the step had worn in a certain place, from repeated use, from the small, accumulated evidence of a person who had sat in this same spot often enough to leave her shape in it. "She would have liked you," Caleb said. "I think I would have liked her. She would have had opinions about your system for organizing the kitchen shelves. She would have been right about most of them." He looked at her sidelong with something in his expression that was new or new in its lack of concealment, a kind of case, the expression of a man in a place where he does not have to manage what shows on his face. "She would have been glad," he said. "About this." Grace looked out at the valley. "I know," she said again. And she did know in the way that some things are known not by being told, but by the accumulation of evidence, by letters and diaries, in the careful arrangements of a woman who had thought about the future with love and clear eyes. She knew it the way she knew the east window of her room caught the morning light, because the evidence was there every day and could not be argued with. 3 years passed, the way years pass when the living of them takes all of a person's attention steadily and without asking permission. Each season, leaving the land and the people in it, changed in ways that are mostly small and occasionally large. The spring of 1882 arrived with more conviction than the spring of 1879 had managed. Or perhaps it only seemed that way because the people watching it arrive were in better condition for the watching. The fence lines that had needed tending in 1879 had been tended. The barn had its new crossbeam and 3 additional stalls. The garden plot behind the house, which had sat gray and unturned through that first difficult winter, had been worked and planted for 2 seasons now and showed what it could do when asked properly. The sign at the gate, which had been a plain board with Morgan burned into it by a hand that had done the job without ceremony, had been replaced with a wider board that read Morgan and Alderton Ranch, the letters clean and deliberate, the paint, the dark green of the hills in summer. Caleb had made the sign himself on a February evening by the fire and had set it at the gate on a cold March morning without making any particular announcement about it, which was consistent with his approach to most things that mattered. Grace had not said anything about it when she saw it from the kitchen window. She had stood there for a moment with her hand on the window frame, looking at the name, and then she had gone back to what she was doing. But she had been smiling in a way that lasted the rest of the day. On the morning that serves as the final picture of this account, a Tuesday in late April, the sky above the valley was the specific blue that only exists for a few weeks each year, too vivid to be ordinary, the blue of a world that has remembered what it knows how to do and is doing it with enthusiasm. The apple tree at the corner of the yard, which Grace had grown from a cutting that Dr. Ford brought from his own tree 3 autumns ago, was in full bloom, white flowers dense on branches that had spent 3 winters deciding whether to commit. They had committed. Grace sat on the top porch step in the mid-morning sun with her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cool while she was not paying attention to it, her back straight and her face turned to the light with the open, unguarded expression of someone in a moment of genuine ease. One hand rested on the curve of her belly where the new child made itself known, with small and emphatic movements at intervals throughout the day, as though already establishing a pattern of regular communication. 6 months, Dr. Ford said, though he had acknowledged that his certainty on the precise timing was moderate. 6 months, which meant the summer, which meant the late heat of August, or the first cool edge of September. Lily ran in the yard below. She was 3 years old, and she ran the way 3-year-olds run with total commitment and no efficiency whatsoever, her dark hair flying loose from the braids that had been tight at breakfast and were now something else entirely. She had been pursuing the rooster for the better part of half an hour with a focus that deserved more success than it had produced. The rooster was not cooperating. This had not diminished her interest in the project. She wore the red dress that Margaret Ford had made for her birthday, which was too nice for running in the yard, but which she had put on herself this morning, while Grace's attention was elsewhere, and which she had presented as a fait accompli, with the calm authority of a child who has learned that certain decisions are best made before they can be discussed. Caleb came around the corner of the barn with a length of new fence rail over one shoulder, which he was taking to the north pasture, where a section had come loose in the last week's wind. He set it down when he reached the yard and watched his daughter pursue the rooster with the expression of a man who has given up trying to look uninvested. The rooster changed direction abruptly, and Lily changed direction too with a shout of delighted outrage at the audacity, and Caleb watched this for a moment and then looked up at the porch where Grace was watching with one hand over her mouth. He picked up the fence rail. "She gets the determination from you," he said. "She gets the velocity from you," Grace said. He went on toward the north pasture, and Grace watched him go, and Lily shouted again from the yard. Then Lily abandoned the rooster, who had retreated behind the woodpile, with the tactical satisfaction of a creature that has outlasted its opponent, and came to the porch with her braids completely surrendered to the morning and her red dress acquiring the evidence of the yard's opinion of it. She climbed the steps with the overhand deliberateness of small children on stairs and came to stand in front of Grace, slightly out of breath, her dark eyes serious in the way they went when she was working something out. "Mama," she said. "Yes." She looked at her for a moment with the earnest, uncomplicated directness of a child who has not yet learned to approach important questions sideways. "Are you my real mama?" The morning held the question for a moment. The apple tree was white against the blue sky. The rooster made a sound from behind the woodpile that suggested it was conducting a review of recent events. Grace set down the cup. She looked at Lily, at the dark hair and the serious eyes and the small hands that were the hands of the woman in the photograph on the bedroom wall, the woman whose rocking chair had been the last wood on the fire on a long, cold night before another woman had walked 2 miles through a storm because she could not let something die when she had the means to stop it. She thought about the night on the road and the cold and the baby's hands gripping her collar, and the voice that had said her name in the dark and found her standing at the edge of the track not knowing which direction was forward. She thought about what it meant to choose a direction and keep walking. "I'm the mama who heard you crying," Grace said, and didn't turn away. She paused. "I think that makes me real enough." Lily considered this with the focused attention she brought to all matters of significance. She looked at the apple tree. She looked back at Grace. "Yes," she said, as though the matter had been adequately established. "Okay." She turned and went back down the steps, redirecting her energy toward a project involving the garden fence that appeared from the outside to be equally unclear in its objective and equally earnest in its pursuit. Grace watched her go. She put her hand back on the curve of her belly and felt the small, deliberate movement there, the steady insistence of a life that had not yet been introduced to the world but was making clear its intention to arrive in it. Down at the gate, the sign she had read from the kitchen window on a March morning caught the light. Morgan and Alderton Ranch. Two names on one board, equal letters settled into the wood. She heard Caleb's voice from the north pasture, something he was saying to one of the men working the fence, and then the sound of the hammer beginning steady and purposeful, the work of a man who knows what he is building toward and is building toward it with his full attention. The apple tree was in full bloom, white flowers in the blue morning. The roots were 3 years deep now, down into the ground that had been hard and gray, and had asked much of the things planted in it, the ground that gave back what was given to it, when given time and tending. The woman who had come with milk and grief looked at her daughter in the yard, and at the tree in bloom, and at the name on the sign at the gate, and at all of it at once, this life that had assembled itself from loss and accident, and the small deliberate choices of people who had kept choosing the harder and more honest thing. She thought about Ellen Morgan in September, sitting at a table somewhere in this house, writing a letter to a city she had never visited, asking for something she would not live to see. She thought about Ralph Dunmore, who had wanted to give someone a decent life and had left the asking of it as the last thing he managed. She thought about Henry, who had lived for 6 weeks and had been sufficient, who was the reason she had been on the road in the storm, who was in the way of the very small and the very brief larger than the space he had occupied. She thought about all the roads and all the storms and all the letters that had arrived late or not at all, and how the things that needed to find each other had found each other anyway stubbornly, and by the long route the way things do when the need is real enough. The hammer went on, Lily went on, the spring went on in its blue and certain way. The apple tree bloomed as it would bloom each spring from now on in the yard of a ranch at the eastern edge of the valley where the roots were deep and the name on the gate meant what it said, and where the people inside had learned through loss and difficulty and the small brave daily choices of ordinary life, the thing that is hardest and most necessary to learn. That belonging is not assigned, it is made. It is made by showing up in the dark and by staying when staying costs something, and by choosing again and again the people and the place and the life that ask for your particular and irreplaceable self, and by knowing when you have found the place where you are asked for that you have arrived.